From Studio 4 in the world headquarters of RT America in our nation's capital, this is the News with Rick Sanchez.
And good evening. Tonight there's news of another alliance that the U.S. is obviously not going to be happy about. But there are those who would argue that it's really blowback from U.S. foreign policy. So I'm going to take you through this. Here's the news in a nutshell on this new alliance. It's about China reaching out to Iran to set up a deal to get massive shipments of oil. China, Iran. Iran is developing new oil fields that are continuing to put them at the top or at the very near the top of the list of countries with the biggest oil reserves in the entire world. In fact, here are the top 6. I put the list out so you can see it. Venezuela's number 1, Saudi Arabia number 2, Canada's number 3, then comes Iran, then comes Iraq, and then comes Russia. Biggest oil reserves in the entire world. Did you notice who's nowhere on that list? In fact, they're not even in the top 10. I think you got to go down to somewhere around 14 to find them. China. However, look where they are on the top of the next list I'm going to show you. Now, this is a list of countries that import oil, right? The top importers, right? China, number 1. The U.S., number 2. This is people who bring it in, not produce it, right? India, number 3. Japan, then South Korea, and then, interestingly enough, the Netherlands, something I never knew but learned as I did this research. So China, because of the frictions and the trade wars with the Trump administration, is looking to import less from the U.S., actually canceling some of the deals they had, and more from Iran. Now, that's the story today. But you know who else China is importing from? Russia. Just last week, President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin announced the opening of the Siberian pipeline to ship natural gas right from northeast Russia into western China. Is there a sudden triad cooperation between Russia, China, and Iran? I mean, really, you ask yourself, what the hell's going on here, right? And is it being formed out of necessity as a backlash to U.S. hostilities with all 3 of these countries, whether it's right or wrong? Nobody's saying the hostilities in some cases aren't right. Or is it something that would have happened no matter what our government did? This is what we're going to tackle because really it's an important trend. I don't know if anybody else is noticing it out there, but this is important stuff and an important story here on the News with Rick Sanchez because it's time to do news again. All right, here we go. The list of the questions we think you're going to be asking tomorrow. Is U.S. foreign policy pushing China, Russia, and Iran into each other's arms? Talk about election meddling. How much did the UAE give to both the Clinton campaign and the Trump campaign? And is rape rampant in a Florida women's prison with guards abusing the inmates? Huge story there. We're going to be all over that. But we're going to begin with a question of whether our foreign policy is fostering an alliance between countries that we are constantly at odds with. Of course, by the way, you could make the argument that those countries, Russia, China, and Iran, have all been bad actors at one time or another for one thing or another or for things they have done or failed to do. But does that make them eternally bound to be branded as the bad guys, or more to the point, enemies forever? Another way of asking this question may be this: why does U.S. foreign policy seem to never change? Let's go there. Let's kick things off tonight with this analysis piece by RT's Morad Gaziev.
The best explanation I've come up with, crude as it is that Pentagon chiefs have synced their cycles. Honestly, it defies reasonable explanation. The next most plausible explanation is that there's some sort of occult initiation ceremony. Every year or so, they come out, each successive defense secretary, and say exactly the same thing, like they're the first ever to say it.
We are working to reallocate our forces and equipment to priority theaters that enable us to better compete with China and Russia.
There seems to be an event, a regular event at the Pentagon that affects their hormones, their brain activity, and makes them act bizarrely. The strangeness manifests itself in them shifting their attention to Russia and China, year after year after year, as if they had their attention on something else.
We face growing threats from revisionist powers as different as China and Russia are from each other.
The first to describe how we're approaching 5 strategic challenges: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism.
Over the long term, we should expect Russia to test our alliance's purpose, stamina, and commitment.
The irony in all of this is that a recent poll found that half of American military families see Russia as an ally. Is television banned at U.S. bases? Did they somehow miss the years-long tidal wave of anti-Russian propaganda on almost every major U.S. network?
Russia definitely had involvement in the American election.
Russia was meddling in our election.
Russia harvested American rage to reshape U.S. politics.
How the Russians are trying to turn the tragedy to their advantage.
They targeted almost every major American social movement.
What the hell was the point? If the target audience, the troops that are supposed to protect America from that imminent Russian invasion NBC promises is coming any hour now, if they, American troops, don't buy it. But of course, the brass has an excuse. American troops refusing propaganda shoveled down their throats for years and actually, get this, the victims of Russian machinations.
There is an effort on the part of Russia to flood the media with disinformation to sow doubt and confusion. This is not only through discordant and inflammatory dialogue, but through false narratives designed to elicit sympathetic views.
And here I thought Hillary Clinton calling half her countrymen deplorables was discordant, or Democrats calling Republicans traitors was inflammatory. I said this before and I'll say it again. Russia, even if it wanted to, could never have done 1/100th of the damage and division done to America by its own media and politicians, who refuse to compromise, who refuse to accept their own countrymen's opinions and views. But no matter what you say to these people, they will squirm, they will twist, they will spit, and always, always turn it into someone else's fault, just not theirs.
More and more Republicans have changed their views on Russia because of President Trump's positive statements about Russia and Russian President Vladimir Putin.
And again, asking the Atlantic Council what it thinks of Russia is like asking the flu virus what it thinks about vaccines. I mean, they're literally paid to say this by arms companies whose sales depend on everyone being afraid of Russia. It's a tough spot. What is a defense secretary to do? Just rhetorical. What they're going to do is shift their attention to Russia. Perhaps this time it'll turn out different.
Now, that was a think piece by Morad, and it may be a little overstated in some places. We understand. But his general point is, Jim Chatras, former U.S. diplomat, that the U.S., our foreign policy, our government continues to push the anti-Iran narrative, the anti-China narrative, the anti-Russia narrative in such a hostile manner. My question to you then is, as a result of that, are we kind of forcing these countries into each other's arms?
Absolutely. Look, I mean, elementary cynical geopolitics 101 should tell you, like, Nixon going to China in the 1970s, it's better to try to be friends with both. At the same time, he had détente with the Soviet Union, to try to play them off of each other and be friendly with both. That would be smart. Right. Instead, if we had sat down with a plan of how we could get these two big giant countries to combine as essentially allies against us, we couldn't have done a better job than we've done.
It seems to me, you're the diplomat, not me. I'm just a layman looking at things out here. But I look at our foreign policy and I see only two types of countries. Countries we hate and are almost willing to go to war with, have been at war with, or are planning to go to war with, or countries we literally adore because they kind of kiss our butts.
vassals and enemies. That's all we've got. We have no diplomacy anymore. And that's where we get to our old friend regime change with so many of these countries. If a country doesn't want to be a vassal, it's an enemy then that must be destroyed, must be flipped into the vassal camp by force, as Iraq was, for example, or or Libya, or we would like to do with Venezuela.
Speaking of Iraq and speaking of Venezuela, I want to show you a list, and I want our viewers to see this. Look at this list that I came across today as I was doing research on this piece. These are the top 10 largest countries, or countries with largest oil reserves in the entire world. Jim, look at that list and go through it for our audience.
Venezuela, enemy, we want to turn to a vassal. Saudi Arabia, vassal. Canada, vassal. Iran, enemy. Iraq was an enemy, flipped it to vassal status. Russia was a vassal in the 1990s. Now it's an enemy. We want to put it back in the vassal status. Kuwait, vassal. UAE, vassal. United States, that's us. Libya, destroy it.
All the countries with the biggest oil reserves in the world are the ones that we either want to go to war with, have gone to war with, or are best friends because they are vassals, as you say?
Vassals.
Define vassal.
Yes. Vassal is a country that is not fully sovereign. That basically, not only its foreign policy, but in many respects, even its internal policies cannot make significant decisions without a mother may I from the bureaucracy here in Washington.
Mother may I. Haven't heard that term since I was a kid. Maybe here's the question then. How do we make this better? I'm American. I want the world to love us. I want to be the good guy. I don't want people to either adore us because they have to, or be hating me all the time simply because because I'm an American. How do we change this?
I don't think we do change it, Rick. I think it's a systemic problem. I think that Trump kicked against it by saying we should put our own interests first instead of this global empire.
But he's just like the other guys.
As it turns out, functionally he is. Whether he wants to be like the other guys or not, he's ended up like the other guys. I don't think it does get fixed.
But if you could, if you tomorrow could be the guy who came in and changed the United States, what's the first thing, or what's the things that you would do? What would be your priorities?
Get out of NATO. I would end our defense pact with South Korea and get our troops out of Korea. I would open diplomatic relations with the Iranians. I would pursue a policy toward the rest of the world like the Russians do, where they can talk to everybody. They can talk to the Israelis. They can talk to the Iranians. They can talk to everybody in the Middle East.
I mean, call them as you see them.
And identify where is our interest. For example, why are we involved in Ukraine? Why are we involved in Syria? We have no interest there.
Venezuela.
Yeah, Venezuela. We have no interest in these places.
Do you want me to tell you why?
Well, because we want to get our mitts on their energy, but we have plenty of our own. Remember, we're a net exporter now.
Yeah.
So why are we doing this? It's not because we need it. It doesn't serve our national interest. It's because this huge bureaucracy that has decided we're the city on the hill, we're the champion of human rights and democracy and all that. We must control the entire globe. It's ideological, Rick.
Probably 20 seconds left, but what about China?
I think China is a country that is not going to. The reason they're building up their energy cooperation with Iran, they understand, and the Russians understand. If the Iranians peace gets taken off the board, they're next.
And they're doing it. And they're doing it. I mean, that's why this alliance is taking place. This is a fascinatingly smart conversation, and I'm glad I had it with you. Thanks, Jim Jeffress, as usual. Tonight, we bring you a story of illegal election interference by a foreign government. The Department of Justice has just delivered an indictment of 8 people involved in conspiring to make and conceal large campaign contributions, at first to the Clinton presidential campaign in 2016, and then to Donald Trump once he had already won. And our special correspondent, Michelle Greenstein, has the details on this story. First, take us through this indictment, because, it's funny. I get the feeling you're going to report this and then nobody else is going to report it, even though it's every bit as vast as the story we've been hearing for 3.5 years now on the Russia meddling, if not more.
It's certainly not getting close to the amount of coverage the Russian interference narrative has been getting. So let's get into this indictment, which was unsealed on December 3rd. According to this indictment, a man named George Nader, a man named Ahmad Khawaja, and 7 others conspired to make and conceal unseal these large campaign contributions, like you said, at first to Hillary Clinton, and then they switched over to Donald Trump once he had won the election. Now, according to the DOJ, these two men conspired with one another to hide over $3.5 million in campaign donations, which appear to be from Khawaja and his wife, but were actually from this other guy named George Nader. Now, Khawaja had never made a political donation before 2015, which was around the time he met George Nader, and then he began donating these thousands of dollars to these Democratic Party campaigns. Now, what really makes this story interesting, because, you know, anyone can donate to whoever they want.
Right.
What makes this an interference story is the fact that the DOJ says that Nader was reporting to a foreign government at the time of his efforts to gain this political influence.
So the way you're describing it, to use Jim Jatras' term, this dude Nader was really just a vassal. He was where the money was going through, but it was really coming through the government of UAE?
That's right. According to the New York Times, they say that the indictment of a close reading of the indictment makes it clear that that unnamed foreign government that the DOJ mentions is actually the UAE.
Wow.
And what's also interesting is that the nickname HH appears in messages between these two gentlemen. And although we don't actually know, according to the DOJ indictment, who HH is, according to other public sources, we do know that Nader was in very close contact with Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and effectively the ruler of the UAE. And we also know that the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi and this effective ruler of the UAE is commonly referred to as High Highness. So it's interesting that we have this foreign head of state being very closely linked to this large donor. And MBZ, interestingly enough, is already one of the biggest political spenders when it comes to the legal ways that you can influence political campaigns.
Two quick questions. What kind of money are we talking about here, and why or how is this illegal?
So it's illegal because if you're reporting, if you're acting on behalf of a foreign government, then you have to disclose that. And that wasn't disclosed. And what we're talking about is—
You're not even allowed to give, Tina. You're not—
Sure,
am
but
I
you
wrong?
also aren't allowed to have meetings unless you disclose that you're acting as an agent of a foreign government.
Could China write a giant check tomorrow to me if I run for president?
Right, you would be able to say no. And we're talking about $3.5 million, which in the scheme of things may not be that big, but if we have to talk about the, imaginary $3.5 million that the Russian government gave to influence the political campaigns
this
here.
one's for real.
Then, right. So you'd think that this would be getting a little more coverage. But let's get into who George Nader was.
And by the way, we should mention DOJ just put out a report today that didn't show that the Russians gave that kind of money. In fact, it didn't find that kind of money. But in this case, they're putting out a report that says UAE did put out that kind of money.
Well, it's an indictment. It's not a conviction. So we'll have to see what happens. But what's really interesting about this case is that George Nader is already in federal custody because he was arrested in June of this year for transporting images of child sex abuse.
Oh, God.
And children as young as 3 years old were shown in these videos enduring this painful abuse. And it's not the first time he's been wrapped up in this sort of thing. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of 10 cases of sexually abusing children, and he only got 1 year of a prison sentence for it. That was in the Czech Republic. Also, in 1991, he was indicted after a customs inspector found at Dulles International Airport child porn in his luggage.
Right.
And he actually pled guilty to this charge. Although while these charges were pending, he was allowed to take 5 trips overseas, which some may say is highly irregular. And also in 1985, there was another case that was opened after a shipment of film and magazines that Nader, received was discovered. And these charges were also dismissed after that evidence that was seized was thrown out. So it's a really interesting figure because he seems to be quite politically connected. Now, we should talk—
But before we drill down too much on George Nader, who I'm sure is a very interesting man and has done some pretty awful things, but, let's talk more about what's going on with the UAE and the fact that they may have influenced the election, because I think there's a comparative analysis here that we should probably consider.
Sure.
What is the difference between the UAE and Russia, for example? The UAE, from a diplomatic standpoint, is our friend.
An ally, sure.
Right.
And speaking of that, what's notable here is that the UAE is actually only one of 5 countries that the CIA does not spy on. So I'm glad you brought that up because the CIA actually does not collect human intelligence, which you could say is the most valuable form of intelligence on the UAE government, according to former CIA officials that spoke with Reuters. But the story about George Nader and the story about the UAE's influence are actually one and the same. So we should talk about how deeply connected this gentleman was with the political establishment here in the U.S. And I'll just give you a few flashpoints as examples. In August of 2016, he was at a meeting in Trump Tower with Donald Trump Jr., the eldest son, Eric Prince, as we know, the founder of Blackwater, George Nader himself, and a man named Joel Zamel, who's a specialist in social media manipulation from PSYOP, which is a private Israeli intelligence company. Now, this is a company whose slogan is Shape Reality, and they brag about using former intelligence operatives. And in this meeting, they said, hey, we support your father. We want to pitch this influence campaign. And also in this meeting, they reportedly bragged about executing a political campaign that would actually help Trump win. So it's interesting that we have this high-level political operative meeting with people not only talking about how to swing the election in favor of Donald Trump, but also other things like overthrowing the government of Iran.
Wow.
So it's a really, really crazy story.
It is, and unbelievable to hear that this kind of thing and this type of influence has happened not only with UAE, it happened with Israel, and it happened as well with the UK. But only one source or one story is told when we hear the story of election meddling. And that's something that our viewers should probably take note of as well.
Problem with ulterior motives of media.
Great reporting.
Thank you.
Great reporting. Good stuff, Michelle. This is a story brewing in Florida tonight that seems to be ripped right from the pages of a made-for-television movie. Kind of a horror at that, right? Women who are serving their time in a women's federal correctional facility are being raped by their guards, according to a new shocking affidavit and lawsuit. It paints the picture of women trapped by their tormentors who are being paid to guard them, right? Protect them. RT correspondent John Huddy has more on this bizarre and troubling story.
One woman called it a bordello, the others a nightmare. Coleman Federal Prison in Central Florida, the focus of a lawsuit filed by 14 current and former prisoners who say they were beaten, raped, and abused by the guards there. The lawsuit is yet another black eye for the Bureau of Prisons and Department of Justice, already under fire for the death of Jeffrey Epstein. Now this, a 78-page lawsuit in which the 14 plaintiffs allege that they endured systematic abuse at the hands of corrupt male guards for years at the women's prison camp. The lawsuit alleges that, despite the Bureau of Prisons' stated mission to protect public safety by ensuring federal offenders serve their sentences in facilities that are safe, humane, cost-efficient, and secure, the BOP, quote, has created and maintained a sanctuary for male correctional officers to sexually assault and abuse female inmates. The sexual abuse at these female prisons is rampant but goes largely unchecked as a result of cultural tolerance, orchestrated cover-ups, and organizational reprisals of inmates who dare to complain or report sexual abuse. The 14 women who use their real names in the suit range in ages from 30 to 56 and are mostly first-time offenders, incarcerated on charges including bank fraud and drug trafficking. The lawsuit goes into, at times, graphic detail about how the women were threatened and coerced, lured into private areas, offices, or field sheds with no surveillance cameras, and then attacked, and how the guards, according to the lawsuit, stalked the women relentlessly until they had no other choice but to submit to their perverse demands. The lawsuit alleges that if the women complained about the abuse, such as being groped, fondled, or forced to perform sex acts on the officers, the inmates were then punished and retaliated against. 7 of the women are still in jail. The Coleman Federal Prison is located in Sumter County, Florida, which is in the central part of the state and houses approximately 6,000 federal inmates in both low and medium security facilities. The campus has a minimum security satellite prison camp housing 500 female inmates. 8 prison officers are directly named in the lawsuit as having perpetrated the alleged abuses, each being described as a, quote, known sexual offender to the Coleman management team and the prison investigative agencies, both of which are also named in the lawsuit and accused of failing to report the crimes and abuses. Several guards have already resigned, been suspended, transferred, or forced into retirement in light of the allegations. Others are apparently still on the BOP's payroll. We reached out to the Bureau of Prisons for comment, but have not heard back. The Miami Herald, which broke the story, says it requested personnel files on all of the named officers to see if there were telltale warnings in their backgrounds. The Bureau of Prisons responded that absent a, quote, overriding public interest, it would not provide such documents, calling the provision of such records an unwarranted invasion of their personal privacy. U.S. Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who called the allegations deeply shocking and disturbing, says that he's following up with U.S. Attorney General William Barr to, quote, ensure that federal correctional facilities are safe and those that engage in this type of behavior are held accountable. For the News with Rick Sanchez, I'm John Huddy.
That's good stuff, John. What an amazing story. Wow. This is also where we get to hear what you have to share with us. And here's what you thought of our coverage of Washington's refusal to allow peace to develop to break out, as we like to say, between Russia and Ukraine. James McBride says the military-industrial complex and scummy politicians are getting paid off. Baha Matero says Ukraine is being used by the U.S. for geopolitical reasons. They were better off when they had good relations with Russia. Brian Cooper says, too bad what the U.S. wants. The grown-up world wants to live in peace. United We Stand says, why do Western nations even need to be asked for anything? It's a Ukrainian and Russian issue. They're allowed to work things out among themselves. And finally, Stick Rock says, RT has a former diplomat offering commentary. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, etc. have retired CIA officers. The contrast could not be more stark. If you want us to know what you think, just send us a note. Leave a comment on our YouTube page, and we might share what you say on the air. Now, if you haven't done so already, join our family. Be a part of the RT family. While you're watching our video, all you got to do is click that subscribe button right there, and you will have joined our club. Speaking of big clubs, let's talk a little bit about Amazon's Jeff Bezos, shall we? Who seems to have his hands in just about everything these days. And now he's firing off another rocket, you might say. Yeah, it's a big rocket. It's part of his latest company. It's called Blue Origin. And what it's doing is firing us test flights of rockets that may eventually carry paying customers, space tourists, if you will, into orbit. RT's Trinity Chavez brings us the latest on Bezos' flying machines.
Blue Origin has successfully sent its New Shepard passenger rocket to space.
5, 4, command engine start, 2, 1.
As you can see, the moment just happened a few minutes ago, and this after several delays this morning because of the weather. But now, after its successful launch, the New Shepard vehicle and the booster have returned to Earth safe and sound. This after a 7-month hiatus from spaceflight. This is the 9th commercial payload mission for New Shepard, marking the 6th time using this specific spacecraft. For the first one was first launched back in December of 2017. This was number 12 in a series of unpiloted test flights before the rocket begins shuttling patrons to space and back. Jeff Bezos, who is also the founder of Amazon, hopes to one day have a reusable rocket generate revenue by flying wealthy tourists to the edge of space to experience a few minutes of weightlessness. But for now, the rocket is filled with thousands of postcards from kids, as well as science experiments from NASA and from students from the University of Columbia here in New York. Now, earlier this year, the company claimed that 2019 would be the year that New Shepard would carry its first crew. In fact, the vehicle that's supposed to fly people is already at Blue Origin's test facility in West Texas, where the company performs its New Shepard launches. However, as I mentioned before, Blue Origin hasn't flown this vehicle since May because the company says that it really wanted to be absolutely sure that the vehicle is ready for people. Blue Origin's CEO, Bob Smith, said in a statement, verifying that you actually have something that's safe and ready to go is where we are. We're just going through all of our systems and making sure that we actually have all those systems right. And while the New Shepard isn't equipped yet to fly people, it has been carrying specific payloads to space along with the research and projects that is in the rocket right now. The last few test flights, it also carried a mannequin named Skywalker that's equipped with sensors to study exactly how the trips will affect human customers in space. For the news with Rick Sanchez, Trinity Chavez, RT.
You go, Skywalker. That's it for us. We'll see you again very soon when it'll be time to do news again.